Inside the mind of Jeffrey Dahmer, the real life of a monster. Once upon a time, in a big city called Milwaukee, there lived a boy named Jeffrey Dahmer. He was born on May 21st, 1960, into a quiet neighborhood with tree-lined streets and friendly families. At first, everything seemed normal for Jeffrey. He lived in a small house with his mom, Joyce, and dad, Lionel. Their house had a cozy backyard where the sun would shine through the trees, making long shadows on the grass. It looked like a peaceful place, but something was not right inside Jeffrey's mind. When Jeffrey was only 4 years old, he had to have surgery for a hernia, a painful problem in his stomach. After this, he changed. He became quiet, almost invisible, as if he was a ghost wandering through his own life. While other kids played outside, rode bikes, and laughed in the summer air, Jeffrey sat alone, watching, thinking. He became more and more distant, drifting like a cloud in the sky, far away from everyone. Jeffrey's family moved around a lot, and each new place made him feel more lost. One house was big and surrounded by woods. Jeffrey would walk alone in those woods, where the trees grew tall and thick, making the world feel dark even in the middle of the day. The wind would whistle through the branches, and the crunch of leaves beneath his feet was the only sound that kept him company. Sometimes he found dead animals, birds, squirrels, small creatures, and he would keep their bones, fascinated by how they looked. His bedroom became a strange collection of jars filled with bones and dead insects. The air in his room always smelled faintly of decay, and it seemed colder than the rest of the house. Jeffrey became obsessed with death. While other boys talked about sports or music, Jeffrey was different. He felt like something was growing inside him, something dark and strange. His parents were too busy with their own problems to notice. His mother, Joyce, was often sick, and his father worked all the time. Their home, once filled with warmth and laughter, now felt cold, filled with the sound of arguments and the silence afterward. When Jeffrey was 15, his parents' marriage fell apart. The sounds of their fights echoed through the house like thunder during a storm. Doors would slam, voices would rise, and Jeffrey would retreat into his own world. When his parents finally divorced, Jeffrey was left with a feeling of deep emptiness, as if the ground had opened beneath him, and he was falling endlessly. To numb his pain, he turned to alcohol. The world around him became blurry, but the dark thoughts in his mind became sharper. Inside Jeffrey's head, things were getting worse. He began fantasizing about having control over people, not just in small ways, but completely. These fantasies were frightening, but they made him feel powerful, something he never felt before. His mind became a prison filled with disturbing thoughts and desires, and he didn't know how to escape. In June 1978, just after Jeffrey finished high school, he committed his first murder. He was driving along a quiet road surrounded by thick woods when he saw a young man named Stephen Hicks hitchhiking. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the road as Jeffrey pulled over to offer him a ride. "Where are you headed?" Jeffrey asked, trying to sound friendly. "Just trying to get home," Stephen replied. "It's a long walk." Jeffrey invited Stephen back to his house for some beers. They sat in the living room where the air felt heavy, the dim light casting long shadows across the walls. Outside, the world was silent, and inside, The only sounds were their voices and the clinking of beer bottles. But as the night wore on, Stephen wanted to leave. Panic surged through Jeffrey's body, and a terrible fear of being alone again filled his mind. "Stay a little longer, just one more drink," Jeffrey pleaded, his voice shaking. But when Stephen tried to leave, something snapped inside Jeffrey. In a sudden act of violence, he struck Stephen with a dumbbell and strangled him. The house, which had been filled with awkward conversation just moments before, fell into a deep, haunting silence. The room now felt like a tomb. The soft ticking of a clock on the wall was the only sound in the eerie stillness. Jeffrey, shaking and scared, realized what he had done. His mind raced, torn between horror and a strange sense of relief. He dismembered Stephen's body, scattering the remains in the woods behind the house. The once peaceful backyard with its tall trees and green grass had become a place of horror. This was the beginning of Jeffrey's dark path. As time went on, Jeffrey's need to control and harm others grew stronger. He moved into a small, dingy apartment in Milwaukee. The building was old, with faded yellow paint and a stale smell that lingered in the hallways. His apartment was a cramped space with bare walls and cheap furniture. The air inside was thick and suffocating, a place where sunlight barely reached. It was the perfect hiding place for his terrible secrets. In the dark streets of Milwaukee, Jeffrey began luring young men to his apartment. The streets were often quiet at night, lit by the soft glow of street lamps, casting long shadows across the sidewalks. People passed by without noticing each other, hurrying to get home. It was easy for Jeffrey to find his victims in the lonely corners of bars and clubs. In his apartment, he would offer them drinks and promise a good time. "Come inside," he would say, his voice calm, but with something cold beneath it. Once inside, he would drug them, his apartment becoming a prison they couldn't escape. The room, which seemed normal at first, would soon transform into a nightmare. The curtains were always drawn, blocking out the outside world, and the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. Each time he committed a murder, the world outside his apartment seemed to blur. Inside his mind, things were becoming even darker. Jeffrey was haunted by his desire to control and possess, and this drove him to experiment with terrifying methods. He would sometimes whisper to his victims, "I just want to keep you here with me." But in his mind, these were hollow words. His actions were driven by a need he couldn't fully understand. One night in May 1991, something changed. Jeffrey brought a young boy named Konorak Sintha Somphone to his apartment. The boy was drugged, but somehow he managed to escape. Barefoot and frightened, Konorak ran through the streets, the city lights reflecting in his terrified eyes. He found 2 police officers and begged for help, his voice trembling. "Please, help me! He's trying to hurt me!" The officers, unsure of what to believe, followed Konorak back to Jeffrey's apartment. The building loomed in the dark, its windows like black holes. Inside, the officers were met with a scene that made their blood run cold. The apartment smelled strange, a mix of decay and chemicals. Photos of dismembered bodies were scattered around the room, and in the refrigerator, they found body parts. The walls, once plain and lifeless, now seemed to close in around them as they realized the horror of what Jeffrey had done. On July 22, 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer was finally arrested. In the police station, He sat under bright fluorescent lights, his face pale, his eyes dark and hollow. The air was thick with tension as he confessed to his crimes, speaking in a calm, almost detached voice. "I should be dead for what I've done," he said softly. His words hung in the air, chilling everyone who heard them. His mind, once filled with confusion and fear, now seemed empty, as if he had given up. He knew there was no escape from what he had done. As news of Jeffrey's arrest spread, the families of his victims were devastated. The city, which once felt safe, now seemed filled with shadows and fear. Catherine Lacey, the mother of Oliver Lacey, one of Dahmer's victims, stood in front of reporters with tears streaming down her face. "My son, why did this happen? He was just trying to live his life." Her voice cracked, and the weight of her grief was unbearable. The Synthesomphone family, too, were overwhelmed with pain. They had trusted the city, trusted that their son was safe, but the world had betrayed them. "We thought he was safe. We thought he was okay," Conorak's father said, his voice breaking. In January 1992, the trial began. The courthouse was filled with people, all waiting to hear the dark details of Jeffrey's crimes. The room was silent except for the soft hum of air conditioning. Jeffrey sat at the defense table, his head lowered, his hands folded in front of him. As the prosecutor described the horrors that had taken place, the air in the room seemed to grow heavier, as if the weight of his actions pressed down on everyone. The jury listened, their faces pale as they heard about the dark fantasies that had taken over Jeffrey's mind. In the end, he was found guilty on all charges. He was given 15 life sentences, which meant he would never be free again. In prison, Jeffrey tried to find some sense of peace. He read religious books and talked about wanting to change. As Jeffrey Dahmer sat alone in his prison cell, the world outside moved on, but his life was stuck in a cycle of regret and reflection. Jeffrey Dahmer sat in his small prison cell. The walls were gray and cold, and the only light came from a small window high above. Each day felt the same. He would lie on the thin mattress, staring at the ceiling. The silence around him was heavy, like a big rock on his chest. He often thought about the people he had hurt. "I didn't want to hurt anyone," he whispered to himself. But deep down, he knew that he had done terrible things. Each night he could hear the sounds of other inmates laughing and talking. It reminded him of the outside world, a world he could no longer be a part of. One day, while sitting in the common area, Jeffrey met an inmate named Ricky. Ricky was tough, with big muscles and tattoos on his arms. He walked over to Jeffrey with a mean look on his face. "So, you're the guy everyone talks about," Ricky said, looking down at him. "The cannibal. What's wrong with you?" Jeffrey felt scared, but tried to stay calm. "I don't know. I was lost. I didn't know how to stop." Ricky laughed. "Lost? That's no excuse. You took lives." Jeffrey's heart sank. He knew Ricky was right. "I know," he replied quietly, looking down at the floor. "I can't change what I did." This was not the last time Jeffrey talked to other inmates. Some were angry, but others were curious about his story. Each conversation made him think more about his actions and the pain he caused. To deal with his feelings, Jeffrey started writing in a journal. He wrote about his life before prison and how he felt now. The words flowed from his pen like water from a tap. "I wish I could take back what I did," he wrote one night. "I didn't know how to connect with people. I pushed them away." Writing helped him think about his past and the lives he changed forever. One day, a news report about him played on the small TV in the common area. It showed families of his victims speaking. One mother, Mary, was crying as she talked about her son. "He was full of dreams, and then he was gone," she said. Jeffrey felt tears in his eyes. He whispered to the screen, "I'm so sorry." He felt the weight of her pain, and it hurt him deeply. As time went on, whispers about Jeffrey filled the prison. Some inmates admired him. Others wanted to hurt him. One day, he was in the prison yard when a young inmate named Christopher came up to him. "I hear you like to collect bones," Christopher said with a smirk. Jeffrey felt a chill. "Stop it," he said, his voice shaking. "I don't want to talk about that." But Christopher laughed, making fun of him. Jeffrey felt angry and scared. He wanted to be left alone, but knew he could not escape the memories of his past. One fateful day, Jeffrey was in the prison gym with other inmates. They were working out together, the sound of weights clanking filling the air. Jeffrey tried to focus, but he felt uneasy. Then Jesse, a big inmate with a bad attitude, approached him. "You think you're tough?" he sneered. "You're just a killer!" Jeffrey tried to ignore him, but Jesse kept pushing. Suddenly, in a fit of rage, Jesse attacked him. The gym erupted into chaos. Jeffrey fell to the ground, unable to defend himself. After the attack, news spread quickly through the prison. Some inmates felt justice had been served, while others mourned the loss of a complicated figure. Jeffrey's life ended that day, but the stories of his victims lived on. Outside the prison, memorials were set up for those he hurt. People placed flowers and candles on the streets, remembering the lives lost. Each name told a story, a reminder of the pain he caused. In the end, Jeffrey Dahmer was not just a name. He became a symbol of loneliness, darkness, and the choices that can lead to tragedy. His story reminded everyone of the importance of connection and compassion in a world that can feel cold and lonely.
Continue boosting your reading and listening skills, and make sure to subscribe to our channel. See you in the next video.